My name is Rory Kennedy, and I am the director and producer of Downfall, the Case Against Boeing.
Boeing has never reached out to us directly. It communicates their lack of remorse, their lack of accountability, and that's infuriating. For them, it was business as usual, but we're the ones who were trying to make sure that other families never have to deal with what we're dealing with.
We've met with, 55 congressmen and women and senators. It's hard. You go and you relive this 55 times in a row and talk about your daughter dying?
This is Factual America. We're brought to you by Alamo Pictures, an Austin and London-based production company making documentaries about America for international audiences. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood. Each week I watch a hit documentary and then talk with the filmmakers and their subjects. This week it is my pleasure to welcome award-winning filmmaker Rory Kennedy, producer and director of the Netflix documentary Downfall, the Case Against Boeing. Once the pride of American technological know-how, Boeing took a wrong turn toward achieving the bottom line at all costs, even if it meant keeping pilots in the dark and putting passengers' lives at risk. In the end, two Boeing 737 airliners crashed, killing 346 people. Boeing's PR campaign immediately went into action to disparage and cast aspersions on the flight crews and their countries. Luckily, the families and a few intrepid reporters and politicians would not take Boeing's word as final. Join us as we discuss the case against Boeing with Rory, as well as the projects she's working on at the moment, including an unfortunately timely project about refugees. Rory Kennedy, welcome to Factual America. How are things with you?
Everything's fine with me. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. Just to remind our listeners that the film we're primarily going to be discussing today is Downfall, the Case Against Boeing. It's come out this year, and it's now currently streaming on Netflix, which is where I caught it. Rory, maybe way we usually start off with our guests is maybe you can give our listeners an idea of what Downfall is about, maybe a synopsis.
Yeah, well, Downfall is a feature documentary about Boeing and the 737 MAX crashes. These were two airplanes, same model of aircraft, the 737 MAX, which crashed within 5 months of each other in 2018, 2019, and 346 people died. Everybody on board both of those aircrafts died. So the film is really an investigation as to what happened exactly, who knew what when, who was responsible for these crashes, with the hopes that we can prevent something like this from ever happening again.
Okay. I mean, as you pointed out, basically we don't need to go into the detail for the engineers, but there's this faulty system on the planes. Is that right? And Boeing was fairly well aware of these things. And there's what you document is the cover up and deception and corporate greed that all played into this. Is that right?
Yeah, basically, Boeing was in competition with Airbus. Airbus had come out with a aircraft that was very popular and was doing quite well in the marketplace. They had a vision initially to create a whole new type of airplane, but they wanted to get something to market quickly to compete with Airbus, and they basically repurposed a 50-year-old airframe, a 737, that was built in the 1960s. They put on a new engines, which are bigger and more fuel efficient. They found when they did that under certain circumstances, the airplane would stall and wouldn't work properly. And so instead of rebuilding the aircraft, they decided they could fix it with a computer system. That computer system is known as the MCAS. It's connected to one sensor on the outside of the airplane. And if that sensor sensed that the airplane was going at a certain angle, it would push the nose of the plane downwards. But in both of these instances, that sensor was sending bad, erroneous information to the MCAS system. And so even though it was not at a steep incline, it was pushing the nose of the airplane down and doing it over and over again, and overpowering anything ultimately that the pilots could do about it.
And I mean, there's loads of, well, not loads, but, you know, obviously plenty of docs about corporations taking shortcuts and things like that. What is it about this case that, in your mind, makes it so different and unique?
Yeah. Well, listen, I think most of us fly, right? And I think, you know, even for the brave and courageous amongst us, there is something odd about being, you know, flying through the air at 500 miles an hour and this kind of metal object at 30,000 feet high. And so I think somewhere in us, certainly for me, there's some fear of flying, right? And I think that it's also, you know, imagining the worst, that it's a horrendous way to think of those last few moments of anybody's life, to be in an airplane that is on a downward spiral. So I think it's kind of something that we can all relate to on some level, and some part of us are all imagine that. And so I think, you know, for me, and I think for most, when you walk down that jetway, you think the people who made this plane are looking out for our safety, that, you know, the regulators, the FAA is doing everything they can do to protect us, that the Congress and the people we've elected are doing their job to make sure that the regulators are empowered to do their job. And in this case, they all failed us. And so I think that there's a lot to be learned from, you know, the need to ask questions, to be vigorous, to make demands for all of us to ensure that, you know, these protections hold.
I think I completely agree. I certainly we all have these fears of flying, but I think one thing that struck me, and I think the film captures it very well, and I was remembering back to when these crashes happened even. And I must admit, I have to say that I kind of bought into the Boeing story at first, because they had this impeccable reputation, didn't they? And I think many of us who, for whatever reasons, would have thought, well, yeah, you know, sure, if Boeing says it's not an issue, you know, these accidents happen, but it was far from it, wasn't it? And it was kind of the big opening up, the sort of the revealing the actuality of what's been going on at Boeing for a while now.
Well, you know, it was also another reason that I was compelled to make this film, is that after these two planes crashed, and they were, as one of our investigators say in the film, under eerily similar circumstances, you know, my expectation, and then they found the black boxes and there was a correlation between the crashes and all that. My expectation was that Boeing would get in front of this, be hugely apologetic. You know, it's like a red flag situation. You know, this has a kind of urgency to it, and taking responsibility. We're going to ground this plane. We're going to do everything we can to figure out what went wrong here. We're going to fix this. This is, you know, there's zero tolerance for this kind of thing. And they didn't really do that. It was much more about, well, the pilots didn't respond the way we thought they would. You know, these pilots were international. How are they trained? There was that kind of thing going on. And it seemed very curious and, you know, not what I wanted to hear from this company in this moment. So I think that was also a kind of driving force for me, is to really get to the bottom of exactly what happened.
Yeah. No, I think in disparaging the pilots and It's Lion Air, which is in Indonesia. It's Ethiopia Air. It's almost, as you've pointed out, it kind of they're not American. Well, not that so much even they weren't American, but almost this idea that these would be places or airlines that would not be capable of flying these planes or not be trained up. But have you, in doing, this was well publicized. There were these congressional hearings. A lot of you deal with you have the journalist from Wall Street Journal who broke some of the story. Is there anything in doing this film? Is there anything you've uncovered that wasn't necessarily public before, or what has maybe struck you the most in actually making the film?
Yeah, well, we were making the film as the story was still unfolding. It was really important to me to, I always think about the word documentary because, and sort of the origin of that, the document, right? So I always try to use source material when I'm making a film like this, and whether that's documents actually, or the people who are on the front lines of this story, and hearing from them as things are unfolding, what they're seeing and what their understanding is. And so, this film really showcases the folks who were in the middle of this story, who were on the front lines of it. So whether it's Congressman DeFazio, who led the investigation, the biggest investigation Congress's Infrastructure and Transportation Committee's history, Andy Pastor, who was the dogged journalist who chased down the story from the Wall Street Journal, Michael Stumo, whose daughter tragically died in the second crash, the Ethiopian crash, and became, an advocate, or the folks who are actually at Boeing working on the airplane and helping to understand what the decisions were made at that time. And the documents, I think, they're part of this story too, was that there was such a saturation, there was so much coming out. So part of my job is weeding through that and really finding the material which is the most important and bringing that to the surface. It's also a story that played out over the course of a couple years, right? So to synthesize it into a 90-minute experience for people, because you sort of trickle in a little information here, a little information there. And when you see it all together, I think it tells a much different story. And then I would just add, you could have read about this story, but there's something about seeing the family members in particular, seeing them, with Muhlenberg at Congress, and how he's not looking into their eyes and looking back at them, and they're holding these posters up of their children. That's so powerful and such a deep reminder of what the actual stakes are in this story, that these people died, that they lost their family. So I think kind of the emotional thread is something that is quite original in this take on and kind of what we explore in this film.
Yeah, and you mentioned Michael Stumo, and so the father of Samuel Rose. Are these are some of the heroes of this tale? If we have heroes, aren't they? Maybe you could you tell us more about that? Because they didn't take no for an answer, did they? Many of them, in terms of continuing to push ahead for answers.
Yeah, the family members, have been so extraordinary, and I just have such admiration for them. Michael Stumo, he lost his just beautiful daughter who had committed herself to global health and really making the world a better place. There were so many people on both of these airplanes that were really extraordinary activists, leaders, people who were committed to making their surroundings and the people, less suffering in the world. So it's just such an enormous loss on that level. But to have lost, for Michael, his child, in this way is just completely unimaginable. And then to learn that it was largely the result of a company and a group of people who were driven by profits, and willing to risk his daughter's life to make more money. I mean, it's hard to imagine how you just don't get consumed by anger, honestly, in a situation like that. But somehow he's managed to kind of redirect all of those emotions in this extraordinary way of, really holding Congress to account to make sure that we find out exactly what happened. And continuing on that effort even today, and sacrificing so much of his own life. I mean, there's one point in the film where Michael talks about how he's had to tell this story, 54 times to members of Congress. And each time it's traumatic. I mean, part of my hope with this film is that he can show the film and he doesn't have to keep telling the story.
I mean, I was going to ask you that. I mean, what is it? Because you're making them relive it yet again by.
Right, and I felt very responsible for that, and it's never something that I ask easily of anybody, because I appreciate the trauma that it can induce in people. In this instance, I really did feel like the film could achieve, along with their efforts and everybody else's efforts, could help to achieve something significant. That was always my hope with it, and to help people be aware, far and wide of what happened. Because there may have been, there are obviously some people who followed this story as it was happening, but there are many people all in this country, around the world, who didn't follow the story, right? And this allows it to be, I think, a little bit more accessible. And so part of my hope is that it will, serve in some way to tell the story so that, these family members don't have to keep doing it.
Yeah, indeed. And I guess there's also this, I mean, there's many threads through all this, but we also have this it's too strong a word, but complicity of the FAA in all this, don't we? I mean, that was, I think, for me at least, that was fairly enlightening that I hadn't necessarily expected. Is that?
Yeah. Well, I think to me, people often ask what's the thing that was most damning that we, found in the making of this film. And I would say that the Tarim report, which was supported by the FAA and was a technical report that came out after the first crash and before the second crash, that concluded that this aircraft had a likelihood of crashing, catastrophic crashes, 15 times over the course of its lifetime, which would average out to once every 2 years. Catastrophic crash means that the plane would crash and everybody on it would die. And that the FAA and Boeing made the decision after that first crash to keep the plane up in the air with the hope that they would be able to fix it before one of these next crashes happened. And so they were basically banking on this and betting against human lives because of financial interests to keep that plane up in the air. And, the FAA was complicitous in that decision. Boeing was a part of that, they were the drivers of that choice. So that to me, especially when you think about Michael Stumo and all the other family members who had children or husbands or wives or mothers or daughter on that plane, the horror of that is unspeakable.
And I mean, I think probably the answer maybe is very obvious and very simple, but what drives people to make decisions like that? I mean, we all fly, most of us do at least, we all have family, we all, to see something like that the likelihood of there being a catastrophic accidents on numerous occasions, and then just to keep the planes in the air.
That, my friend, is a question for those executives at Boeing. I mean, I cannot, in my soul of souls, answer that question.
I mean, it's not like they're poorly paid and they're, they're doing, it's, yeah. Well, I think that's probably the best way of putting it, because it's just hard to fathom it at all. That
Yeah, I do not understand what would drive a decision like that. I mean, Mullenberg, who was the head of the company, the CEO during this time, he was asked to leave by the board. He wasn't even fired. He was asked to leave, and he walked away with $62 million. I don't understand that decision either.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people watch this story and there's this disconnect because 346 people died.
All right.
Boeing is responsible. Boeing and the executives there and the management made a series of decisions that are very clearly driven by the desire to make profit and to make money. And 346 people die and nobody goes to prison, and none of the management is really held to account. So why is it, if you went and killed one person, you'd probably spend the rest of your life in prison. Why is a corporation protected? Why are the people who run corporations protected? What is that? And what kind of priority is that? Why should corporations be held to different standards than human beings and the human beings who run those corporations? Why?
Yeah. And I mean, I guess that raises the question, are you surprised there's not even why isn't there a bigger public outcry about these sort of things?
Well, there's a huge public outcry. If you go on Twitter, it's an unprecedented. I mean, Newsweek just did a piece on the response to the film around the world. And I mean, Twitter's going off on it. But, again, but meanwhile, Boeing stock is going up. Right.
Yeah.
So how out of touch is Wall Street and how much valuation they're putting in this company when you're having such an outcry from people around the world who are outraged by this? So, I think that disconnect, I mean, it's like during COVID, all these people are losing their jobs. The economy is sinking and Wall Street's just going up and up and up. Like how disconnected is that entity from the rest of us? And what does that mean? And how can we make more of, how can we get that in more of an alignment?
Sounds like the subject of another doc that you're going to have to make. But I guess to maybe one last point on this is that in the end, I mean, Boeing has only received barely a slap on the wrist from this, isn't that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the Department of Justice, had a case and they fined Boeing $2.5 billion, but I think that was 4% of their the money that they made that particular year, right? So it sounds like a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of things, it's Congressman DeFazio, who led the investigation, called it a slap on the wrist in terms of like its impact on Boeing. And a lot of that money, when you kind of dig into it, was money that they were paying to the airlines for grounding the plane. So it was the cost of not really delivering an entity that was guaranteed to fly. So a fraction of that cost actually went to the families themselves. And there was an agreement in there that if Boeing didn't do anything else that was, at this level of damning, that there would be they would be protected from a criminal prosecution. So nobody would be held accountable. So, there's I think I don't want to speak on behalf of the families, but I think many of the families and many other people felt like that was not, again, in alignment with the horrors of what happened.
Okay. I think that takes us to a point to give our listeners a break. We'll be right back with Rory Kennedy Downfall, The Case Against Boeing is the film, now streaming on Netflix. If you enjoy Factual America, check out the Movie Maker podcast. That's all one word, Movie Maker, where our friends at moviemaker.com interview everyone from filmmakers just breaking in to A-listers like David Fincher and Edgar Wright about their movie-making secrets and behind-the-scenes tricks of the trade. They go deep and let the guests speak uninterrupted to get you the most film insight. Now back to Factual America. Welcome back to Factual America. I'm here with award-winning filmmaker Rory Kennedy. She's just come out with a film produced and directed, Downfall, The Case Against Boeing. It's now streaming on Netflix. We were just talking about the slap on the wrist that Boeing's received and other things related to that. I mean, maybe that we've kind of alluded to it already, but when you were, as a filmmaker, when you're thinking about the next film you're going to make, what attracted you to this story? Why did you want to document this and now? Because I guess you probably have your choice of projects you could work on.
Yeah, well, I mean, like everybody else, so many other people in the world, I fly. And I really, I mean, it was really following the story of the two airplanes crashing, them being, the same airplane, new airplanes, no weather conditions, as Andy Pastor, dogged journalist, says, under eerily similar circumstances. And 346 people are dead. And yet the response from Boeing in the wake of that was to really focus on blaming the pilots, it seemed. So I felt like there was a lot more going on here that deserved some attention. I mean, part of it was to get to the bottom of it, to understand what happened, and to, in an effort to make sure this doesn't happen again.
Yeah. So that's, in essence, that's what you would also like the legacy of this film to be. Is that safe to say? That people see this and then take action?
I hope that people see this and take action. And, that action can take a lot of different forms. And the film doesn't advocate a particular action, in part because what I want to do is really lay down the facts of the story to show what happened. And then people see those facts and you respond in different ways. I saw these facts. I, as a documentary filmmaker, decided to make a documentary about it, right? Andy Pastor, as a journalist, saw the facts and he decided to chase down this story for almost 2 years. DeFazio, a congressman, decided he was going to run an investigation. So, other people might be activists and go out into the street. So I think we all have to kind of figure out what is our path to making and demanding the changes individually. But I do think that the world's going to be a better place if we're all out there demanding it.
Yeah. Speaking of the world, I wanted to if you don't mind, if we look ahead a bit in terms of, am I right in understanding? It's based on IMDb. Do you have a film about World War II refugees in the works coming up?
I do. I have a film that I am working on right now about the global refugee crisis.
So we're 8 days into a war in Ukraine. Could you have ever imagined how timely this? I mean, obviously there's been Syrian refugees and refugees from the Middle East, but could you have ever imagined that war was going to be raging again in Europe when you started to make this film?
I didn't. I thought we had gone beyond that, honestly. It's just such an outrage and such a disappointment. And, I'm really disgusted by Putin and his decision to go after this, wonderful, beautiful country and the Ukrainian people and kill so many people. It's horrendous. I mean, as of, I think, yesterday, there were 650,000 people who were refugees as a result of this already. The projection is that it's going to be between 3 and 5 million people.
That's right.
So it's going to really put a lot of strain on a system that's already, we have 26.5 million refugees in the world today, 80 million displaced people. So, it is for a whole range of reasons, an enormous disappointment.
Yeah, and I mean, I hate to because it just has just started, and it is such a horrific set of events that are happening right now. So I guess it's kind of hard to ask questions that seem a bit cold in response. But is this something that you're already taking on board in terms of telling this story that you're working on in terms of the refugees? Is this, I guess you can't help but include it in
Yeah.
this project.
Yeah, no, it's definitely something that we're focusing on. So, and of course the Afghanistan situation occurred also while we were editing this. So the film, keeps opening up again as we deal with, more and more crises that are unfolding in front of us. But it's an important part of the story. And I think, what we're really looking at in this film is Western wealthy countries' responses to the refugee crisis over time, and looking at World War II in the context of initially being a refugee crisis, that the Jewish people in Germany in particular were trying to find a place to go. Hitler had said, okay, fine, they can leave. But there were no countries that would accept them. Very few countries would accept them, right? So and then after World War II, we kind of came together with the United Nations and the Global Refugee Conference to agree to terms of, if people were in jeopardy, if they were facing something that could risk their lives in their own country, that they would be accepted in one of our countries. And we've really failed in that obligation. And even now with the Ukrainian situation, I think and I would encourage all of us to monitor, because everybody's saying their hearts go out and they're empathetic and they're outraged, but who's going to open their doors, right? And how much are, Poland is the neighboring country. How much are we going to support Poland for doing that? Britain, last I heard they were saying, well, they can come here if they have relatives who are already in our country. The United States, I'm not seeing opening our doors in any significant way yet. So I hope that changes. But, let's see how many of these wealthy Western countries really open their doors in significant ways to the Ukrainian people. My hope is that we do. And then, it then begs another question, which is, okay, which my hope is that we do this with the Ukrainians, but then, and we're certainly doing it more than we did with Afghanistan or with Syria. And how much of this is based on, oh, well, these people look a little bit more like us, right? And we can relate. Is that going on here? And what are kind of some of the racist undertones of some of the policies and responses? So I think all of those questions are worth considering and keeping an eye on.
Yeah, and I guess may I ask? I guess now it's getting harder to say, but roughly when are you hoping to release this film?
Well, exactly. It keeps opening up. So my hope is that it will be sometime in the fall or winter of next year.
Okay, so of 2023. Is that right?
Yeah, probably in probably the winter of 2023. So in 8 months from now.
Okay, I see.
So,
okay, well, we look for. I mean, I think that's.
But don't quote me on that.
No, we won't quote you. Or don't. I know there's. No, it's just great to have a filmmaker who can talk about a future project. They almost always say, "Well, I've got something, but I can't really talk about it at the moment." So it's great to be able to discuss it. And I also just happened to come across it. And it's such a timely issue that we all need to consider and to discuss. So I'm so glad you're making that.
Thank you.
What else? Do you have anything else in the works?
Well, I do have another project, but I'm not allowed to go into detail on that one.
Okay.
Another documentary I'm doing with Netflix. And then I'm also started something called the Climate Emergency Fund a couple of years ago, which is a foundation that supports activists who are causing a bit of disruption in the effort to protect our climate and our world. So we basically raise money and then we give it to activists who go out in the street and do things to make sure that we're really focused on this issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I saw an interview with John Kerry, actually, just it was filmed about a week or so ago, where he basically said, well, this is before the invasion, but even so, he said, Russia, Ukraine notwithstanding, that was still, let's not forget, that's still probably the biggest issue facing us as a humankind. And so it's obviously for the very moment, at the moment, probably taking a bit of a backseat in terms of people's consciousness, but I think it's obviously a very, very important thing.
Yes. And the IPCC, which is the international conglomeration of climate scientists, just came out with another report in the last week that is really showing, the devastation that climate change is having and wreaking across the world right now to literally billions of people. And the prediction that that's only going to get worse unless we do something about it, but we really have to do it now. And, you see, and it really shouldn't take a backseat to Ukraine and Russia because it's all
intertwined.
part of the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Because Russia has so much of the energy source, right? And so how much are we going to really cut off Russia? How much is Russia going into the Ukraine have to do with energy? And, what can we do to reduce our reliance on that source of energy and move towards solar and wind and sources of energy that are environmentally more healthful.
And it's the Russian permafrost that's also melting, that's releasing methane into the atmosphere, that's also contributing to global warming.
Which is 10 times more, potent than carbon and is a significant concern. So I think there's, it's still all in the mix. And then you see these bombs going off and the environmental damage just done in a war zone situation. So, obviously first and foremost is our love and empathy and compassion for those folks who are being harmed and killed, and that it's just horrendous. But I think there are a lot of issues in the mix here that we need to be focused on.
Well, and I think you're helping us focus on them. So do appreciate your efforts for that on that front. And to say, unfortunately, it looks like I think we've come to the end of our time together. So just wanted to thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. It's very much appreciated. Would love if once these other docs come out, we'd love to have you on again if we haven't scared you off. And just to thank Rory Kennedy again, award-winning filmmaker of Downfall, The Case Against Boeing, streaming on Netflix. Rory, thank you for coming on to Factual America.
Thanks for having me. Great talking with you.
It's great talking with you. Take care and stay safe.
All right, you too.
If something's not right, you need to find it and get it fixed or get it corrected. To ensure safety, finding things was what you're supposed to do. But instead of fixing problems, everything was about speed. Everything was about getting stuff done. Let's move it, let's get it done. You can't stop, you can't slow down.
Used to be when you raise your hand and say, we got a problem here, they would say, yeah, you're right, we're gonna fix it. After the merger with McDonnell Douglas, the Airbus coming on, Boeing quit listening to their employees. So every time I'd raise my hand and say, hey, we got a problem here, they would attack the messenger and ignore the message.
I'd like to give a shout out to Sam and Joe Graves at Intersound Audio in Eskrick, England, in deepest, darkest Yorkshire. A big thanks to Nevin Apaunovich, podcast manager at Alamo Pictures, who ensures we continue getting great guests onto the show. And finally, a big thanks to our listeners. As always, we love to hear from you, so please keep sending us feedback and episode ideas. You can reach out to us on YouTube, social media, or directly by going to our website, www.factualamerica.com, and clicking on the Get in Touch link. And as always, please remember to like us and share us with your friends and family, wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. This is Factual America, signing off. You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guests, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures. Be the first to hear about new productions, festivals showing our films, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.